everybody. It is 5:30. It's the Tuesday. I'm very excited to have a conversation tonight, and I've got a little scotch on the rocks that I'm going to enjoy during my conversation. Grab a drink. Pete Buttigieg is joining us. Pete is a wonderful guy. Obviously, oops, I think I just screwed this up. Let me see if I can do this. That's not Pete yet. Anyway, hi, Amy. Hi, Amy Rosenblum. Anyway, we're going to have a conversation with Pete Buttigieg. It's going to be fun, probably a little wonky for all of you politicos out there who love to talk about foreign policy and what happened in the election. And here's Pete now. Hopefully he'll be joining us in a minute. I've got so much I want to talk to him about. Hi, Pete.
Hey, how are you?
Good. Nice to see you. How are you?
Here. Good. Happy almost Thanksgiving.
Happy almost Thanksgiving to you. What do you and Chasten have planned? I'm going to have a drink while we talk. Do you mind, Pete?
Oh, good. I didn't realize that was the order of the day. I would have joined you with that.
Yeah, free.
Yeah, we're looking forward to it. Chasten's here with the dogs will be smaller than usual. I think like so many families, we're re-engineering, but we're going to spend some time here in South Bend with my mom, who a lot of folks were asking about her. She took a spill, broke her wrist, but she is on the mend and in great spirits. So thanks to everybody who sent in kind wishes there. I lost your audio. Say again?
Just the three of you?
Yeah. It's a smaller Thanksgiving than we're used to, but
Yeah.
I think a lot of families are getting used to that this time. And safety first, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
How about you?
Who's going to be doing the cooking?
You know, Chasten's definitely the chef in the household, but I specialize on dishes and prep. But we'll see what we can figure out this year.
I'm going to be having Thanksgiving with my husband. We're going to turn it into like Valentine's Day in November.
Oh, nice.
Have a romantic Thanksgiving. So we'll see how that goes. But
I like it.
I've got so much to talk to you about. First of all, you've been really busy. You've written a book called Trust. You've got a new podcast. I mean, who doesn't have a podcast at this point, Pete? Called The Deciding Decade. I've got your book right here. It's backwards, but it's not in real life. And you've got a pack called When the Era. So you've been really quite busy. What is taking most of your time these days?
Well, like you said, there's a lot going on. Also, I'm grading right now because I just wrapped up a semester teaching at Notre Dame, which has been a real joy, engaging with students who are coming of age in this incredibly unstable and challenging moment. And it's been on the subject of trust, the same as the book, that has just been a subject that's really had my attention, especially through this year, because we're facing all these issues that are going to require cooperation: climate change, racial and economic justice, COVID, of course. And so I think it's a good time to be thinking about that. So that's been taking a lot of my energy and attention, but also relishing a chance now that the bulk of the campaign season is behind us to spend a little more time with family as we go into the end of the year. Not knowing exactly what next year will bring, but sure that it's going to bring, I think, a better day for our country. I'm just so thrilled to see the way that the president-elect is building the leadership team that's going to carry us forward. And, it's going to be challenging. There are going to be challenges on Capitol Hill for sure, and we know what we're up against as a country. But I also think this is a real season to be ready for a lot of big action, because we just don't have a choice as a country.
Well, we've seen obviously Janet Yellen, Secretary of the Treasury, first woman to be Secretary of the Treasury, Avril Haines, Director of National Intelligence. We have the first Latino head of Homeland Security, and he was Deputy Homeland Security head, wasn't he, during President
That's
Obama?
right, yeah, and somebody with a deep cybersecurity experience and somebody whose own experience as an immigrant to the U.S. From a Cuban family. I think really positions him well. Yeah, Mayorkas, yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's going to position him really well to lead a department that needs to not only keep America safe, but also do this in a way that keeps our values and our integrity safe, which means really rethinking, obviously, what's going on at the border and a lot of other areas. So it's just an all-star team. It's diverse. It reflects the country. And I think it shows a level of seriousness. These are not people who are there because of political favoritism. These are people who are there because they know what they're doing, and they've earned the president-elect's trust.
Well, what do you think? Do you think that Mitch McConnell, if the Democrats do not win the Senate, we'll talk about that in a moment, do you think Mitch McConnell and his brethren will try to block some of these nominations?
They might try. Look, there's been a real spirit of obstruction for years with Mitch McConnell in the Senate and GOP. And even when you have somebody who's clearly qualified, I mean, just look what they did to Merrick Garland, who was a very well-respected jurist that they refused to even give a hearing when he was nominated to the court. Having said that, I mean, these are people who command a lot of respect across American society on both sides of the aisle. And I really hope that they are given that basic courtesy, and that the president is given a chance to build the cabinet that he needs. I mean, look, the stuff we're up against as a country is no joke. We've got COVID, we've got international threats, we've got the China challenge, we've got so much that requires a team ready to hit the ground on day one. It is, I think, a matter of national duty for the Senate to partner with this administration to make that happen.
A lot of people were wishing that you were on that stage today, Pete. I know you're not, you never spill the beans. I know you want to make news on my Instagram Live. So do you have anything you want to announce? No. In all seriousness, are you interested in focusing on domestic policy or foreign policy?
Well, I'm really excited about where those areas intersect. And, there's so many things that need attention, that need energy, and that need work. And, of course, I'd be thrilled to return to public service. But no, I don't have any news to make tonight.
Well, but which would you prefer to channel? Where would you like to channel your energy? I know you have a lot of interests in both arenas. And yes, I know they intersect, but most jobs don't necessarily, aren't a combination of those two disciplines. Yeah. When you think about it, what really, gets you excited?
Well, again, I mean, part of what excites me is how these things come together. You think about something like the climate challenge. I mean, that's hyper local in some ways. We've seen the way that mayors have come together in order to deal with that, while the government in Washington wasn't doing the job under this president. We've also seen a global network of cities whose respective capitals around the world had that same frustration, and they've come together. If you think about an issue that's very important to my part of the country around the economy, and making sure that we set up economic policy, industrial policy, trade policy in ways that work for workers, that's a very local and a very international conversation. So I guess what I'm saying is that these things have never been more intertwined. And yeah, there are different roles that work on different pieces of the puzzle. But I think it's really important, as I talked about in my own campaign, when my foreign policy address was largely about what it would mean to have a foreign policy for South Bend. I think we've got to do a much better job at showing how these things relate to each other, because if there's one thing that COVID has taught us, it's how a chain of events that begins thousands of miles away can turn our lives upside down right here in the middle of the U.S. And I think we've got to have more of that mentality about how we relate to the world around us.
Well, in every arena, the world is flat, as Tom Friedman,
Exactly.
wrote several years ago. And I think you're right. It is interconnected. Let me ask you about John Kerry's post as kind of climate change position. It doesn't require Senate confirmation because of that. But that sends a pretty strong signal about the Biden administration's seriousness about climate change, don't you think?
Yeah, I think this is a really important development, because it sends that message that this is going to be a central priority. I mean, John Kerry is one of the most recognizable figures in U.S. politics. He's represented the U.S. around the world as the Secretary of State, and remember, played a key role in the negotiation of climate agreements up until now. Since he's been out of public office, he's led efforts to bring together different players around climate. So it's not just that he's qualified for it, it's that someone of his stature can help send a signal that, by the way, I think is also important. Not only is it important for the purposes of climate change that we get out there and lead around the world, I also think it's important for America's leadership around the world that we show we're serious on climate change. In other words, if we want to be taken seriously as a global leader, if we want to recover some of the credibility that we really lost under the outgoing president, then there's no better way to do that than to be rallying countries around the world to deal with something that affects you, whether you're on a Pacific island or a Nordic nation near the Arctic Circle or right here in Indiana, and that's climate change.
I know he cares deeply about the oceans. I interviewed him at the State Department before he left the administration, and I ended up asking him too many questions about ISIS, where I think he got quite annoyed with me. So hopefully he won't be mad at me, and we can talk about the environment the next time we meet. But ISIS was just sort of came out of nowhere, and it was suddenly on the front pages. Um, you know, let me ask you about some other policy issues. And with the transition, now that the head of the GSA has said that the transition process can begin, how much lost time do you think there has been?
Well, there was certainly a cost, and that cost was getting greater every day. So this is a moment to really make up for lost time. Now, the good news is, this was not a surprise to the transition team. Even over the summer, there were conversations going on about how to prepare for the fact that this administration was not going to leave on gracious or easy terms. And so this has really been kind of baked into the game plan from the get-go. But this ascertainment, it unlocks a whole bunch of things from what seemed like very kind of technical procedural things like access to systems to really important issues about who can talk to who. Current administration officials were not supposed to even talk to transition officials until that call was made. Now that it has been, on things from understanding where the resources are to get ready to do what's going to be a huge lift around getting everybody vaccinated for COVID.
Right.
Things like making sure that the president-elect is getting what's called the PDB, the Presidential Daily Brief. That's the kind of most important product of the intelligence community. That stuff snapping into action is going to make a big difference. And I do think that this transition is ready to work at double time and make up for any of the intransigence or delaying or soft pedaling that the outgoing president unfortunately was doing.
Yeah, I want to talk about that some more and kind of the erosion of trust.
Yeah.
Having to do with your book, but the erosion of trust in our election system. But the question I wanted to ask that flew out of my brain momentarily was about the Iranian nuclear deal and TPP. Do you think that that the toothpaste is out of the tube? Because I know the Iranians have revved up their nuclear program once the U.S. pulled out, where a lot of European countries are trying to resuscitate that deal. Do you think it's possible to do that, or do you think that really valuable time has been lost?
I think there is still an opportunity. Iran is under enormous economic pressure, and we have so many allies around the world who want to see this happen. Now, maybe that means a way to put together the deal as we knew it once again. Maybe it means some kind of modified future version that accounts for some of the things that the last deal did. That's one of the top things that I think the incoming president and his national security team are going to have to deal with. But what we know is that we need to act to stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. That's what the whole point of the deal, and it was working. And we've lost time, but all is not lost. And some of those same things that brought them to the table the first time around are going to bring them to the table this time around too. I think that the challenge, and this is going to be true whether we're talking Iran, whether we're talking climate, you name it, is we got to establish that you can do business with the United States, that you can trust us, that we're not just one presidential election away from going back on our word all over again. And that's, that goes beyond what any one administration can do. I mean, this means creating a political climate where we're committed to certain things as a country, where we clarify that we are committed for the long haul to democracy, to a more stable world order, to a fairer economy. That's the work of a generation. And this is just the beginning of starting to restore our credibility on that.
Well, let's talk about that, because 70% of Republicans, according to a poll that I read about in Politico, they do not believe the election was free and fair. So you're operating from a huge deficit when it comes to bringing the country together, having a certain sort of level of belief in basic facts and a trust in our institutions.
Yeah.
So given that, I mean, where do you even begin?
So to me, the only answer is to start delivering for people. These ideas, these conspiracy theories, these accusations about election impropriety, they are garbage, let's be clear. But that sort of thing finds more fertile ground, more people ready to believe it, if they feel like they can't trust any system or any establishment because nothing works. And there is, I think, in any society that's got the kind of inequality that we have today, it's going to work in strange ways to warp our political and social fabric. And I think that's part of how we got to where we got to with the Trump phenomenon. That doesn't end when the Trump presidency ends. So, this is why it's going to be so important for this administration coming right out of the gate to deliver things that Joe Biden campaigned on, one with that most Americans want. And this is the big thing we have going for us, even if you got a Senate under Mitch McConnell who's not cooperative. It's this. So most Americans want us to act on climate change. Most Americans believe that the wealthy and corporations ought to pay their fair share in taxes. Most Americans think that science is real. We ought to listen to what doctors have to say about things like COVID. Most Americans think that it's nuts that we don't have paid family leave in this country and want to see a solution on childcare and are prepared to ask government to do a better job of delivering some of these things. These are areas that not just Democrats, but most Americans think we ought to do. And I think the Senate can only go so long facing down the American people and stopping this when this is not just a Democratic priority, although it's part of the Democratic platform. It's what Americans expect. The more we can deliver, the more we can build trust. The more trust we have, the more we can deliver.
And also, you have to deliver what's happening. And unfortunately, as you well know, Pete, people are living in their own echo chambers where they're getting information on alternate facts to basically confirm, confirmation bias. They're getting affirmation, not
Yeah.
a friend of mine always says. So, what do you do about that? Because it's one thing to do what people want. It's another thing to let them know what is actually happening and not get a distorted view from one side of the aisle or another, either one.
That's right. And, this is one of the reasons why I've become a frequent flyer in territory like Fox News that's not known for being friendly to Democrats. Because
You
I
did
think,
a job on Fox News, by the way.
thanks. So, I just think when you see an information bubble like that, you have a duty to try to poke a hole in that wall. And I know that there are people tuning in good faith who just get different information or get, frankly, misinformation. And we've got to do something about that. But I also think, again, that results have a remarkable way of changing things. Don't get me wrong. You don't always get credit for results. And I'll give you a great example. 12 years ago, there was a terrible economic crisis and there was a presidential transition. And Barack Obama worked with the outgoing Bush team to make sure that there was a plan to rescue the auto industry. That brought our part of the country back from the brink. And frankly, Joe Biden, Barack Obama didn't get a lot of credit for it. On the other hand, you look at something like the Affordable Care Act, which as a party, we were getting killed on this 10 years ago. I remember my first time running for office was in 2010. That was a brutal year to be a Democrat running for office because we were getting beat up on Obamacare. Within a few years, that same policy, that same issue, it became the winning issue for my party because people saw what it did in their lives and they didn't want to have their pre-existing conditions taken away.
You heard them talk about it at all those town
Yeah,
halls.
exactly. And look at the difference between the 2010 town halls, where we were getting killed by people from the Tea Party yelling about death panels and all this stuff, to the town halls in 2018, when you had a lot of Republican members of Congress, with voters getting in their face saying, hey, this is what it would mean in my life if you took away my health care. Because it turned out it was very hard to trick voters about their own lives.
Why do you think 72 million Americans voted for Donald Trump?
Well, I think a lot of it goes to what you were saying earlier. They're getting different information. It's not just looking at the same set of facts and having a different take or worldview or values. A lot of it is, frankly, a different set of so-called facts, not all of which are, in fact, real. But there are other things, too, going on. And, in the end, I really do believe the way that Joe Biden has talked about this has hit on something important. The idea of a kind of battle for the soul of our nation. As human beings, we can be reached in ways that call us to our highest values. We can be reached in ways that bring out the worst in us, that speak to our fears rather than our hopes, that speak to our anxieties and resentments more than what makes us big-hearted. And, it's not a difference between good people and bad people. It's a difference between whether what's good or bad in us has been reached. And this is really important. And, sometimes I take heat for talking about, within my own party, for talking about the importance of connecting with people in our lives who don't see the world the way we do. But the reason it's so important is I want to live in a world where the vast majority of Americans agree that what we've been through in the last 4 years is completely unacceptable. And by definition, in order for us to live in a world where pretty much everybody thinks that in the future, that means a lot of the people who voted this way, voted his way in the present, will have to change their minds. We have to create a space where that's possible. And I think it is. But it's going to take a lot of work.
What about the Democratic Party, Pete? I mean, it's not, there seems to be, at least that's the narrative. There's a lot of disunity between centrists and progressives. And it seemed the fear of socialism message really did actually work and send a lot of people into Donald Trump's arms and at the polling places. So, uh, how can the Democratic Party look less fragmented in this way?
Well, we're a famously big tent party. We're always going to be. There's no point trying to do away with that. It's part of what makes our party one that I'm glad to belong to. But we do need to recognize the ways that the other side sometimes weaponizes what we have to say, and make sure that we're smart about that. The whole socialism thing is a good example, because it's almost lost all meaning. I mean, what are we talking about? Are we talking about Canada, or are we talking about Venezuela, right? Are we talking about Denmark, or are we talking about Cuba? And that word hits people differently depending on their generation, depending on where they grew up. Look, for anybody my age or younger, I think that this socialism doesn't have that kind of magic dark power as a word.
Right.
Because again, we're thinking about things like European social democracy and everybody getting healthcare and that kind of thing. But if you grew up on stories from a parent or a grandparent who fled a brutal regime somewhere in Latin America that used the word socialism to describe itself, that word has a very different, very visceral, very powerful effect. And so we need to be really smart about that. I'm not saying that we should be afraid of speaking boldly. Sometimes our job is to change the meaning of these terms. And sometimes they get changed on us. Here's something nobody talks about. The word progressive used to be a word that was used by people who were afraid to admit that they were liberal. Liberal meant that you were too far to the left. So people started saying progressive as a way to say without saying. It was the more kind of safe term. Now progressive means like a muscular, kind of further left position, all just because of the politics of language in our country. And I think we got to pay more attention to the language and the effect that has on people.
Well, as I said for several weeks now, that defunding the police needs rebranding because I think it's so subject to misinterpretation by people. But I guess reappropriating, city funds
Yeah.
and shifting priorities is too hard to explain. But I thought that was a real whiff.
Well, here's one way to think about it. If you talk to thoughtful figures in law enforcement, they'll tell you that one thing that's really wrong with the way things work today is that mental health resources don't exist. And somebody in mental health crisis, the closest thing they'll see to a mental health first responder is a police officer. The closest thing they'll get to an inpatient mental health treatment is a night in jail. And it totally makes sense that more resources would go to mental health. And if we did that, it might be that there would actually be less need for some of the things law enforcement are called to do. Now, that's not an attack on anybody, but it is a common sense policy. And coupling that kind of thing with the need for greater accountability around policing, that, by the way, makes police more legitimate, that also makes police more effective at their job. These are things that we can do. Let me put it another way. It's got to be the case that racial justice is compatible with good policing. It's just got to be. And yet we've allowed ourselves to be drawn in largely because it was viewed as useful to the Trump campaign into this world where somehow you gotta pick one, as if it's somehow anti-law to believe in racial justice.
But do you think that's all from the Trump campaign? Don't you think that's from all sides, that it's become such a black and white issue and that people need to pick sides and they can't both want racial justice and police reform, that you're either pro police or pro
Right.
racial? And I think it's very difficult for some people in the current climate too, and when you think about bifurcated media, for people to have these nuanced conversations.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we're definitely in a media environment that doesn't encourage nuance. And, these things were not invented by the outgoing president. They were exploited by the outgoing president. That's exactly why we have an obligation to be tougher customers for some of the kind of algorithms that come around and try to just pack us into corners. And I don't just mean ideologically. I mean, they just make it harder and harder for us to even be standing on the same field of fact or talking about the same reality. And that's, no one person has every piece of the puzzle there. It's greater responsibility by social media companies for what's on their platforms. It's smarter policy at non-federal as well as federal government, but also all of us taking care to question and be skeptical of what we hear.
Let me ask you some questions from social because I have a lot of smart followers. I'm sure you do too, Pete. One is, are you planning to be campaigning in Georgia for the runoffs?
For sure. I have already been doing it virtually. Might get a chance to do it physically if we can do that in a safe way too, because so much really does depend on the Senate. Look, we have a chance in these two elections. And by the way, the Biden-Harris success proves that Georgia is in fact a purple state, a battleground state, a swing state. And I know both of these candidates well. In John Ossoff, you have a new generation, energetic, smart campaigner who I think really has an instinct for how to speak to the issues. And in Reverend Warnock, an extraordinary figure who is the preacher at the same pulpit where Dr. King preached, Ebenezer Baptist in Atlanta. Somebody who understands how to speak to these issues of racial and economic justice, and again, do it in a way that actually adds and multiplies rather than divides. These are the kind of leaders we need in the US Senate. So it's true as individuals, but also you think about the party aspect of it. And I know that sometimes people think of divided government as a recipe for
In
balance.
fact, Paul Ryan said something about that today, that it would be helpful for Joe Biden, that Republicans would be more willing to work with him if they controlled the Senate.
Yeah, I just don't buy it. Not this time around. I get the thought, and there's a kind of common sense aspect to it. But if you look at the way that this Senate majority has behaved, I think divided government is not going to lead to balance. It's going to be a recipe for paralysis. Now, there are ways to deal with it, and the president might be forced to do just that. But we have not seen a lot of good faith compromise coming out of this Senate majority. I'd be delighted to be proven wrong and see it happen, but I still think the best recipe for things to happen, by the way, there'll still be a lot of moderates holding a lot of power in both parties, especially if it's a 50-50 Senate with Vice President Harris as the tiebreaker. It's not like that's going to have our country lurching, way in one direction without any kind of reason or deliberation. But at least we'll be better positioned to deliver legislation on the things Americans want. Again, climate action, higher wages, better labor conditions, the things that the American people have voted for.
A lot of people, though, are worried without Trump on the ballot, people are not going to be motivated to get out there and vote on January 5th. Is that something you're concerned about?
Yeah, it's always a problem when you hear about the presidency talked about like it was the only office that matters. And the truth is, obviously defeating President Trump was a huge priority that motivated so many of us to be active and to get out and to vote. But that's not enough. This is the chance to really double down on the idea of what we're for. And if what you're for is legislation that's going to give us family leave and expand access to voting and make it harder for us to have this racial voter suppression and actually have policies that are oriented around American working families and not just taking care of those who are already best off. That's what we have a chance to vote for and work for in Georgia.
And in fact, someone said on social, how can we unite the Midwest and coastal politics? Where can we find common ground on healthcare, jobs, and social issues? You basically just said it.
Yeah, I mean, we have an opportunity to build a powerful multiracial coalition around making our lives better. Again, these are largely policies that our counterparts in every other developed country already enjoy, whether we're talking about access to healthcare or better infrastructure. And these things, they can't seem to get a majority in the American Congress these days, especially in the Senate, but they have a majority support among the American people. And I think especially here in the Midwest, my party needs to do a better job of reminding everybody exactly what it is we stand for. And by the way, who's standing in the way when we try to do things like raise wages or empower workers or make it easier to vote.
Infrastructure is something that I think is very bipartisan, something that you believe deeply in. Do you think that finally something's going to be done about infrastructure? It seems like such a no-brainer, providing jobs, improving bridges and roads that have really fallen into terrible disrepair.
Yeah, I mean, again, why should Americans settle for lagging behind other countries when it comes to the roads we drive on? And by the way, as a mayor, I'm really into the unsexy underground infrastructure, water, wastewater, that stuff. You're not supposed to have to even think about it. But as we saw tragically in the case of Flint, when you do have to think about it, it wrecks everything else in your life when you can't count on a glass of clean, safe drinking water. So whether we're talking about water, whether we're talking about transportation, or whether we're talking about climate, right? Because this is a huge part of the puzzle of how we get to where we need to on climate. Infrastructure is going to be huge. Most Americans want it. It's good for the economy. My hope is that this is an example of where both parties in the Senate would come to the table with the president, who is definitely going to be leading on that issue.
You know, somebody just asked on the comments, how dangerous is Donald Trump once he's out of office? He's clearly got a huge hold and a cult following. You know, how do you solve a problem like Donald Trump after he's left the White House?
Well, beating him was definitely step one, but that's only the beginning. And the biggest thing we need to do is to starve that fire of its oxygen. And the oxygen, in my view, is resentment. We need to be a country that takes care of people. And his style of politics finds less fertile ground in a country where there's less inequality, more stability, more decency. And yes, that's what a President Biden can lead on, but that's homework for all of us.
Someone wanted to know, what is your stance on Black Lives Matter and uniting people on issues of race?
Right.
I
Well,
have people,
yeah.
uh, current climate, I think, have become almost more divided than they were before.
Yeah, and it shouldn't be divisive to believe and to say that Black lives matter, that Black Americans should not be at a constant disadvantage, not just in terms of facing police violence, but in terms of health, in terms of access to educational opportunity, in terms of access to economic opportunity. I mean, if you look through the data, in fact, I mentioned some of this, things like credit scoring and neighborhood values. I mentioned this in my book. The system continues to unfairly distrust Black Americans in ways that have a real cost, and is one of the reasons why Black Americans have been skeptical in trusting the American establishment and institutions, even though it's the activism of Black Americans that help deliver things like greater democracy, making our country, one where everybody, at least in theory and in law, we're not there yet, but where everybody has that right to vote. So this is an example of something that we really need change on. And here's the most important thing. A lot of the change has to happen among white Americans who do not think of themselves as racist in any way, and yet are caught up in systems and habits and structures that perpetuate these racist outcomes. And all of us need to take a look in the mirror. It's not just about defeating the likes of the Ku Klux Klan, who go out beating their chests knowing that they're racist. It's about all of us, especially white Americans, who intellectually hate the idea of racism, and yet might carry with us a kind of toxin, because we have grown up in a country where everything is racialized, where unspoken assumptions about neighborhoods, schools, people, safety are actually full of all of these racial codes, and we got to come to terms with that. And it's right and fitting that Black voices have been leading the way this year, but the work and the change has to happen among white people first and foremost.
I think some of it is how we're taught history
Yeah,
and how we understand the past. Many people have been taught a sanitized version of
yeah,
history. This is not being overly woke, but it's just factually inaccurate.
yeah.
And probably need to read more Howard Zinn and fewer high school history books that are approved by the state of Texas, which is a whole nother.
Yeah, no, we've got to come. There's the historian Walter Benjamin said that even the dead are not safe from the enemy if he wins. Faulkner said the past is never dead; it isn't even past. We got to come to terms with our history, and it doesn't have to be an exercise in guilt and shame, but it's going to take some honesty and some reckoning. And when we do, it sets all of us free to do better work for the future.
I think a great example of that is the incredible work Brian Stevenson has done at the Equal.
Yes, absolutely.
You know, he
Yeah,
said the goal isn't people feel guilty or feel ashamed of the past, but just to understand it and appreciate it and see it sort of the 360 view, which I think is so critically important, because I think that plants the seeds of our attitudes. And I think that could change a lot of things. Let me just ask you one other social media question, Pete, because I want to be responsive to people who took the time to send these to me. Where do you see the old school unions and the new school union movement going? Do you think unions are successfully on their way back? This is kind of the wonky stuff that you probably love, and I think it's
Yeah.
so important because I'm super interested in the union movement. What happened to it? How it used to protect American workers? Do you think they, overreached? Where do you think the future of unions, what do you think is going to happen?
What a great question. And we actually just recorded a podcast on this subject. So you can check out on The Deciding Decade, which is my podcast, a wonderful conversation about this. I think there's huge opportunity here. Look, unions over the years were painted with this reputation of being kind of old-fashioned, resistant to change. But you look at the innovation that's going on, organizing whole sectors of workers who hadn't been organized. The people I met in Nevada who were organizing for better conditions, working in Las Vegas and looking after people who really lack basic protections. The work being done around supporting domestic workers, the work that SEIU is doing around fast food workers, expanding who can organize, but also some of the work that is happening in the more traditional, let's say bigger, so to speak, house of labor, is also really responsive to the moment we're in. For example, I've been in a lot of kind of economic development conversations where people are wringing their hands saying, we just need to find some way to do more training for people who need job skills training, but who aren't going to college. Well, guess what? That is exactly what building trades apprenticeships programs have been doing this whole time. But they could use a better partnership with policymakers and with the private sector to do it. I think that this decade could be a period of real flourishing, but we have to contend with some anti-labor policies that have really hemmed in and made it harder for labor. And that's one area where I do think that we can kind of reshuffle the coalition of a lot of labor union members who may have voted Republican, but who, again, we need to do a better job of reminding that it's going to be my party that's supporting the right to organize and to expand that kind of organization.
Having said that, Pete, do you think you're frozen for a second? Don't you think there were some flaws in the union movement that that made it very difficult? I mean, I think there's a balance, isn't there? And weren't there cases where it became untenable to for businesses to placate unions at some point? And by the way, I think unions are great. I'm just saying, weren't there some issues?
Sure. I mean, I also experienced this as a mayor, where we had a lot of bargaining units among our city employees, and often, coming to terms on wages was the easy part. It was the working conditions where we had to make sure that workers were supported, but it didn't create all kinds of things that made it harder to actually get the job done. And I do think there have been frustrations that are understandable, but the balance of power has shifted so dramatically against workers right now. And we got to remember that the years when we had stronger labor were not years when you couldn't do business. As a matter of fact, those were a very good period for growth in this country. Business flourished when workers were flourishing, and we don't see that right now. So sure, there are lots of things that could have been done differently by labor organizations. Some of them also slow to the table when it came to being more racially inclusive and more gender equitable. Although again, some of the fastest growing unions are the ones that have been really leading the way on that multiracial, all-gender coalition. So this is a chance, I think, to turn the page from some of what we've seen in the recriminations of the past, and really make sure workers are empowered in a way that makes the whole economy better off.
Hey, before we go, hey, is Chaston there? Does he want to say hi?
I don't know. I can. Hey, love, you here? Want to come say hi?
Tell him to come say hi. Before we do, would you ever run for office in Indiana? I know, Obama won it, and then Trump won it by 16 points in 2016. Is it just too hard to be a Democrat in Indiana?
I don't think so. I don't think there's such thing as a permanently red state. I mean, we went Democratic in 2008, so nothing is forever. Hey, look, Katie just wanted to say hi.
Oh. Hey, Aston.
Hi.
Hey, how you doing?
Good. Nice to see you. Happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving. I hear you're cooking the Thanksgiving feast. What's on the menu?
I don't know yet. I mean, my favorite thing is mashed potatoes, and it doesn't have to be anything else. I'm a meat and potatoes boy. So it's just the three of us. So I feel like a turkey is silly.
Yeah, we
Well,
may call in some strategic reinforcements and do
Yeah.
some
Maybe like
creative
Cornish
reading.
hens or I don't know.
I don't know. I think you should make a turkey. Make a little one. Can you get a small turkey? I don't
Like
know.
itty bitty baby turkey. I don't know. We'll
We'll
see.
figure it out.
I
Good to
just
see
want
you.
to say hi and happy Thanksgiving.
Oh, happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you.
You kids have fun.
It's always great and so interesting to talk to you about all kinds of things. And I know a lot of people are really hoping that you're going to play some role in the Biden administration. I know you're not going to say a word to me, but at some point, if you do get tapped for a job, will you come back and do an Instagram live with me again or some kind of interview? Maybe
I look forward. Yeah.
maybe you'll come on my podcast.
Oh, there you go.
Maybe
Yeah.
we'll switch and we can talk about the future of media and you can talk about the future of the country and the world.
Save me a seat. Sounds good.
Okay, Pete. All right. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks. Same here. Thanks for having me. Happy Thanksgiving. Great seeing you.
Bye,
You're
everybody.
welcome.
Bye.